bottle slipped at 9:47 p.m. Cassie Monroe had been carrying wine professionally for 4 years, which meant she had developed the particular spatial awareness of someone who moved through crowded rooms with full hands for a living, the ability to track a tray's center of gravity while simultaneously navigating a chair pushed back without warning, a child crossing at ankle height, a guest who turned to gesture with both arms at exactly the wrong moment. She had not spilled a drink in 14 months. She knew this because her manager, Derek, tracked these things on a whiteboard in the back office with the loving attention of someone who considered accident-free streaks a form of personal achievement. 14 months. She was going to have to tell Derek tomorrow. The restaurant was called Aurelius. It occupied the ground floor of a building in the River North neighborhood of Chicago that had been a bank in a previous life, and the architects who'd converted it had kept enough of the original bones that the ceiling was still coffered, and the columns were still marble, and the whole place had the particular hush of somewhere that took itself seriously. The tables were dark walnut, the linens were ivory, the lighting was the specific warm amber of rooms, designed to make everyone inside them look slightly better than they actually did. A meal for two with wine ran close to $400. The clientele were the kind of people who made reservations 3 weeks out and sent the bread back if it wasn't warm enough. Cassie had worked here long enough to be good at it. Not just technically good, not just accurate with the orders and smooth with the service, but genuinely skilled in the way of someone who had figured out that waiting tables at this level was actually about reading people, knowing when a table wanted conversation and when they wanted to be left alone, knowing when someone was celebrating something real and when they were performing celebration for a companion who wasn't as happy as they were supposed to be, knowing when a guest was difficult because they were difficult, and when they were difficult because something was wrong. She was good at all of it. What she was not good at, what she had never been particularly good at, was managing her own nervous system in the presence of something that registered as a threat before her brain had decided whether it actually was one. She'd felt it the moment Table 7 was seated. Not the whole table. Table 7 had 4 guests tonight, a couple celebrating what the reservation notes described as an anniversary, and 2 other men who had the polished, comfortable ease of people accustomed to expensive restaurants. She'd taken their drink orders without incident, delivered the bread, recited the specials. Normal. Fine. But the 5th chair. The reservation had been for 4. The 5th chair had been added at the last minute, a request that had come through the front desk 20 minutes before service, and the man who occupied it had arrived separately, after the others were already seated, moving through the restaurant with the kind of self-contained quiet that made the room rearrange itself slightly around him without anyone quite noticing that it had. He sat at the corner of the table. He had not looked at the menu. He had not ordered a drink. He sat with his hands resting on the table, and his posture absolutely composed, and his eyes moving through the room in the careful, unhurried way of someone who is not observing out of curiosity, but out of long habit. The habit of someone who had been the most alert person in every room they'd ever occupied for a very long time. He was extraordinarily handsome. Cassie noticed this the way she noticed most things about guests, practically, and at a slight distance, because noticing things about guests was her job, and acting on those things in any personal sense was not. He was tall, even-seated, with dark hair that fell to just below his collar, sharp, clean features, a jaw that looked like it had been decided on rather than arrived at. He wore a white dress shirt and dark jacket, and he wore them the way certain people wore clothes, like the clothes had been designed specifically for his proportions and had never considered any other application. His eyes, when they briefly crossed hers during her initial approach, were dark gray. She'd taken his non-order without comment and moved on. The spill happened on her second pass. She was carrying a bottle of the Barolo they'd ordered for the table, doing the pour in the correct sequence, starting with the woman to the left of the host and working around, and everything was going fine until the anniversary wife shifted her chair back at the exact moment Cassie was passing behind her, and the corner of the chair caught the back of Cassie's knee, and her balance went. Not catastrophically, not a full fall, just a lurch. Just the 3 inches of displacement that was enough. The bottle tipped. The wine went left. And the man in the corner chair, who had been sitting absolutely still, was now wearing approximately 4 ounces of 2018 Barolo on the front of his white dress shirt. The table went silent, the kind of silence that preceded either a scene or a mercy, and Cassie was already moving, napkin out, professional instinct overriding the particular horror of the moment, mouth forming the words she was trained to say in exactly this situation. "I am so sorry," she said. "Sir, I am so sorry. Please let me." She pressed the folded napkin to the stain and looked up to assess the damage and gauge the guest's expression, and was prepared for any of several reactions: anger, cold displeasure, the theatrical sigh of someone who was going to make this into a story about poor service. She was not prepared for what actually happened. He smiled. It arrived slowly, the way sunrise arrived, not all at once but in increments, each one changing the quality of what came before it. The corner of his mouth first, then the full curve of it, then something that reached his eyes and transformed them from the careful, contained gray she'd catalogued on her first approach into something warmer and more complicated. Something that looked like a man surprised by his own reaction to a moment he hadn't anticipated. It was, she would think later, the most quietly devastating thing she'd ever seen happen to a human face. Except, she would also think later, it wasn't a human face. She didn't know that yet. Right now she knew only that she was pressing a linen napkin to the chest of a very expensively dressed man she'd just doused in red wine, and he was smiling at her in a way that made her forget, for approximately 3 seconds, every protocol she'd been trained to follow in exactly this situation. "Please don't," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying just enough volume to be heard over the ambient noise of the restaurant without effort. It occupied a register that felt less like speech and more like the sound a room made when it settled. She stopped pressing the napkin. "Don't apologize," he said. "It was an accident." One of the other men at the table, the one nearest the anniversary couple, made a sound that Cassie couldn't quite interpret. Something between discomfort and the particular held breath quality of someone watching a situation they hadn't expected. The woman, the anniversary wife, was looking between Cassie and the man in the corner chair with unconcealed interest. "Sir," Cassie said, recovering. "I'll have the restaurant cover any cleaning costs, of course, and I can bring you a club soda immediately to start treating the fabric, and I'll speak to my manager about." He shook his head once. Slightly. The gesture of someone dismissing something they'd already considered and set aside. "The shirt is fine," he said. It was a white shirt, and there was a 6-inch burgundy stain spreading from his left lapel across his chest, and it was absolutely not fine. And Cassie knew enough about fabric and enough about wine to know that fine was not a word that applied to this situation unless the speaker had access to resources that made the shirt replaceable without a second thought. She looked at him. He looked back. The smile had settled into something quieter now, not the full initial arrival of it, but the quality it left behind. A slight warmth around the eyes that hadn't been there before, a fractional easing of the composed containment that was his default expression. "Can I bring you something else?" she said. "To drink. Anything. It's on the house." He looked at her for a moment. "Water," he said. "Thank you." She went to get the water. She stood at the service station for a moment with her hands flat on the cool metal surface and breathed, which was something she did when she needed to reset between tables, a trick she'd learned in her first year when the pace of the restaurant could feel overwhelming. In and out. The moment passed. You moved on. She was moving on. Except her hands were slightly unsteady, which had never happened at the service station before, which she attributed to the adrenaline of the spill and not to anything else, because the anything else was not a professional thought, and she was a professional. She brought him his water. He accepted it with a nod. Their fingers didn't touch during the transfer. She was precise about that, about keeping the handoff clean, and she thought she saw something in his expression register the precision, the same way someone might notice a small and specific skill and catalog it without commenting. She got through the rest of the service. She was good at this. Getting through things was what she did. She'd grown up in a household that ran on managed crisis, and she'd taken that particular competency and made it into a career, which was not the most conventional application of childhood coping strategies, but was at least a practical one. She smiled at the right moments and refilled the glasses and delivered the courses with the timing that Derek described, without any self-awareness, as masterful, and she did all of it with the surface ease of someone who was not thinking about the man in the corner chair. She was absolutely thinking about the man in the corner chair. Not in a way she planned to do anything about, just in the involuntary, peripheral way that the mind returned to things that hadn't been fully processed, the way you kept almost touching a bruise to see if it still hurt. The table stayed for 2.5 hours. She checked on them at appropriate intervals. He never ordered food. He drank the water, and then a second glass of water, and sat with the same quality of unhurried stillness for the entire length of the meal, occasionally speaking to the others at the table in a low voice she couldn't catch from the distances service required, occasionally sitting in complete silence that the others seemed not to find unusual. When the table settled the check, the 4 others stood and gathered their things with the comfortable inefficiency of people who'd had a good evening. She was at the service station and didn't see the tip until she went to clear the table. She saw it and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked across the restaurant toward the exit. He was the last of the 5 to leave. He was pulling on his jacket at the door, and for a reason she wasn't able to fully articulate to herself, she crossed the floor. "Sir," she said. He turned. She held out the folded bills. "This is too much," she said. He looked at the money. Then, at her. "For the shirt," he said, "since you wouldn't let me apologize." She looked at him for a moment. The restaurant moved around them, the ambient sounds of other tables and kitchen noise and the soft music that Derek had spent considerable effort calibrating to the exact volume that said expensive, without saying trying. "I spilled on you," she said. "You don't owe me for the shirt." He looked at her with that same focused attention, the gray eyes doing the thing she'd noticed earlier, settling on her face and staying there. "Keep it," he said. And he left. She told her roommate about it that night. Priya was pre-med and chronically sleep-deprived, and had the specific gift of being able to listen to the things Cassie said, while simultaneously studying for things Cassie didn't understand. And she performed this gift at the kitchen table, while Cassie sat across from her with a cup of tea she'd made to have something to do with her hands. He smiled, Cassie said. Like, genuinely smiled. At me, after I dumped wine on him. Priya turned a page. Rich guys are weird. He wasn't weird. Cassie thought about it. He was the opposite of weird. He was the most composed person I've ever served, and I've served a sitting senator. Priya looked up briefly. Did he ask for your number? No. Did you want him to? Cassie looked at her tea. That's not the point. That's always the point, Priya said, not unkindly, and went back to her textbook. Cassie went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the smile. Not the man specifically, not in a way that required her to examine too carefully what she was doing, just the smile itself, the quality of it, the way it had arrived like something unexpected in a face that had been prepared for everything else, like a door opening in a wall you'd already decided was solid. She slept eventually. She didn't expect to see him again. Aurelius had regulars, guests who came once a month or once a week, who had their preferred tables and their usual orders and their preferred servers, who Cassie knew by name and drink preference and dietary restriction. But the man from table 7 had not been a regular. He'd been an addition to an existing reservation, a last-minute chair, a variable. He came back the following Friday, alone this time, Reservation for one, under a name she read off the book when Derek handed her the seating chart for the evening. Voss. One guest. Table 4, which was the corner 2 top by the window that Aurelius reserved for guests who wanted privacy and the pretense of watching the street. She recognized him the moment he walked in. He was wearing dark again, a different shirt this time, deep charcoal, and he moved through the restaurant the same way he'd moved through it before, with that quality of self-contained quiet that made the room rearrange slightly around him. The host brought him to table 4, and he sat and he looked at the menu this time, which felt somehow like information. Derek appeared at her shoulder. "That's your table," he said, in the tone he used when he considered a table's assignment self-evidently correct. She already knew. She approached table 4 with the same professional composure she brought to every table, which required, this time, a small but real act of will. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome back." He looked up from the menu. Recognition moved through his expression, and then something else, something she filed away before she could examine it too closely. "You remember me," he said. "You left a significant tip," she said. "I tend to remember that." The corner of his mouth moved. Not the full smile from last week, but its precursor, the ghost of it. She took his order. He was eating this time, and he ordered with the brevity of someone who had already decided before arriving. No questions about the menu, no requests to modify, just the selection stated cleanly, and the menu returned. She brought his food. She checked on him once, at the appropriate interval. He was unhurried. He ate without looking at his phone, without reading, without the various props people use to fill the space of dining alone. He simply sat and ate and looked occasionally at the street through the window with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that was his resting face, composed and slightly remote and carrying underneath it, like a frequency you felt more than heard, something that was not quite sadness, but was adjacent to it, like a man who had everything and had discovered that everything was not the thing he'd been looking for. She was clearing a neighboring table when he spoke. "The chair," he said. She turned. He was looking at her. "Last week. The anniversary woman's chair. It caught your knee." She looked at him. "Yes. You apologized for 7 minutes," he said, "to me and to the table and to my shirt." He paused. "You didn't accept my explanation that it wasn't your fault." "It was my table," she said. "My responsibility." He looked at her steadily. "And if something outside your control creates a consequence in your territory, you consider it your failure." She held the stack of cleared plates. "That's a very philosophical way to describe a wine spill. I have a lot of time to think," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Can I get you anything else?" she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes doing their thing, settled and present. "What time do you finish tonight?" he asked. She held very still for a moment. 11, she said. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something. She went back to the service station and stood there for 3 seconds longer than she needed to. Then, she went back to work. He was still there at 10:50. He'd ordered dessert, which he'd barely touched, and a second water, and he'd sat at table 4 for 2 hours, with the patience of something geological. When she brought his check, he looked at it and produced a card, and completed the transaction with the focused efficiency of someone for whom the mechanics of paying were genuinely irrelevant. She brought his receipt. He stood. He was taller than she'd registered from a serving distance. "I'll wait outside," he said. "If you'd like." She looked at him. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No," he agreed. "That's why I'd like to wait." He was standing on the sidewalk when she came out. Not pacing, not checking his phone, not performing the waiting of someone who wanted to be seen waiting. Just standing, hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking at the street with the same quality of unhurried attention he brought to everything, as if the street and its traffic and the November cold were as interesting as anything else, and he was in no particular hurry for the next thing to begin. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. She'd changed out of her work clothes in the back, the server's uniform replaced by her own jeans and coat, and the scarf she'd been meaning to repair at the left end, where the yarn had started to unravel. She felt, standing next to him in the sidewalk light, like a person standing next to something from a different category of existence. "Walk with me," he said. "Or we can find somewhere to sit, whichever you prefer." She preferred walking. She always thought better when she was moving, had made her best decisions and processed her hardest moments on foot, covering ground as a substitute for covering distance on the things that couldn't be walked away from. They walked. He matched her pace exactly, which she noticed, the way he calibrated to her without comment or adjustment, as if her pace were simply the correct pace, and no other had occurred to him. His name was Elias Voss, he told her. He'd been in Chicago for some time. He described his work in the same way she'd heard wealthy people describe work before, with a vagueness that was itself a form of information. Real estate. Holdings. The management of things that had been accumulating for a while. "And you," he said. She told him. Aurelius was 4 nights a week. She had a degree in communications that she'd completed 3 years ago and used primarily as evidence that she could finish things. She was working on something else now, she said, and when he asked what, she told him she was writing, which was the first time she'd said that to anyone outside of Priya, because saying it made it a thing she could be wrong about. "What do you write?" he asked. She looked at the sidewalk. "Stories." She paused. The kind where things happen to people, and the people have to decide who they are because of it. He was quiet for a moment. "That's all stories," he said. She looked at him. "Most people say that's interesting, and change the subject. Most people," he said, "are not particularly interested in the things they claim to find interesting." She thought about that. They walked for an hour. The city did its city things around them, late traffic, the smell of cold air and restaurant exhaust, the particular quality of Chicago in November that was hostile in a way she'd come to find almost affectionate, like a place that respected you enough not to pretend it was comfortable. He asked good questions, not the performed questions of someone conducting a social transaction, but the actual questions of someone who wanted information and knew how to ask for it. He asked about the stories and what made her choose a thing to write about, and what she was afraid of when she sat down to do it. She told him she was afraid of being ordinary, that the writing would come out and be ordinary, and she would have to accept that she was someone who tried and produced ordinary things, and she didn't know what she'd do with that. He looked at her. "You're not ordinary," he said. She looked back. "You've known me for a week and a half." "Long enough," he said, "and I've had a long time to develop accurate judgment about people." She thought about that phrase. Long time. The way he used it, not as hyperbole, not as the casual exaggeration of someone who'd had a difficult year, but as a statement of something actual. "How old are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Older than I look," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were on a bridge, a pedestrian bridge over the river, and the water below was dark, and the city light reflected off it in long, broken lines. The cold came up off the water, and she pulled her coat closer. She looked at his face in the bridge light. She thought about the restaurant, the way the room had moved around him, the way the other men at his table had held a very specific quality of attention in his direction, not the attention of friends. Something more structured than that, something with hierarchy in it. The way he sat for 2 hours, without his phone, without any of the objects people use to fill time, because he had apparently been filling time for long enough that he no longer needed help with it. "You're going to tell me something," she said, "that you think might be a problem." He looked at her with the gray eyes, steady and present. "Yes," he said. "Okay," she said. "Not tonight," he said, "but soon." She looked at him for a long moment. The river moved below them. The city breathed around them. "Okay," she said again. They walked back to Aurelius, where her car was in the staff lot, and he stood on the sidewalk while she found her keys and unlocked the door, and she turned before she got in and looked at him. "Same time next Friday," she said. He looked at her. "I'll make a reservation," he said. She got in the car. In the rearview mirror pulling out of the lot, she could see him still standing there, watching, hands in his pockets, perfectly still in the way of something that had learned stillness as a survival skill and now wore it like a second skin. She drove home through the dark and thought about what it meant to be standing at the edge of something you couldn't see the bottom of and deciding to look anyway. He came the next Friday. And the Friday after that. Table 4 became his table in the way that things became certain people's things at Aurelius, through repetition and the particular quality of presence that made a space remember someone. The other servers started working around his reservation without being told to. Derek, who had the instincts of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms for a living, said nothing to Cassie directly, but began assigning her table 4 with a consistency that was its own form of commentary. The meals lasted 2 hours, sometimes longer. He ordered differently each time, which she noticed, working through the menu with the methodical interest of someone experiencing it seriously rather than casually. He had opinions about the food, not performative opinions, not the opinions of a guest who wanted to demonstrate knowledge, but actual reactions. Things he found interesting and things he found less interesting, stated simply when she asked and not otherwise volunteered. She asked, "On the third Friday, what's your favorite thing on the menu so far?" He looked at her with the slight quality of surprise he occasionally showed when she asked something directly. "The bread," he said. She looked at him. "The bread is complimentary," she said. "I know," he said. "It's still the best thing." She thought about that for the rest of the evening, in a way that she suspected said something about her she wasn't entirely ready to examine. They kept walking after each shift. The walks got longer. The conversation got deeper in the way of something that had found its channel and was following it. Not pushed, but pulled, drawn by its own direction. She told him about her family, her parents in Ohio who called every Sunday and asked when she was coming home in a tone that was loving and slightly baffled by the choices she'd made. Her younger brother, who was 22 and studying environmental science, and had the particular certainty of someone who hadn't yet been wrong about anything important. He listened to all of it. He told her things too, incrementally, carefully, the way you built something that needed to be weight-bearing, one piece placed precisely before the next was added. He'd lived in other cities before Chicago. Many of them. He named a few. Paris, Vienna, a city in Spain she knew from history rather than geography, and he described them with the texture of personal memory rather than historical knowledge. The way you described a neighborhood you'd actually walked rather than read about. She was building a picture. It was an incomplete picture, had obvious gaps that she could feel the shape of without being able to see what filled them, but the parts she could see were consistent and specific and did not have the quality of invention. He wasn't performing history. He was reporting it. She sat with that. The fifth Friday he arrived with something different in his posture. Not distress, nothing that alarming, but a tightness she hadn't seen before, a quality of something being held that was heavier than usual. She noticed it on his approach to the table and filed it without comment, the way she filed everything, for later assessment. She took his order. She brought his food. She checked on him at the appropriate interval. She brought his check. He paid. Outside, walking, he was quieter than usual, and she matched him, understanding from experience that some silences wanted company, and some wanted to be pressed, and she was learning which kind were his. Eventually he said, "I had a conversation today that I found difficult." She waited. "With my counsel," he said. She'd heard that word from him before. Counsel. She'd held it at arm's length, not asking, letting him bring things at his own pace. "About me," she said. "Not a question. About the situation," he said, "which includes you." She looked at him. What did they say? That I'm being reckless, he said. That I'm allowing proximity without protocol. That there are rules for a reason. Rules, she said. He was quiet for a moment. About humans, he said. About how we interact with them. He paused. With you. She stopped walking. He stopped, beside her. They were on the same bridge as the first walk. She didn't think that was accidental. She looked at him in the bridge light, at his face, at the gray eyes and the long brown hair and the sharp composed features that she'd spent 5 weeks memorizing without meaning to. You're going to tell me now, she said. Yes, he said. And when I hear it, she said, it's going to explain the things that haven't made sense. Yes, like why you sat for 2 hours without your phone that first night. Yes. And why you described Vienna like you'd lived there. Yes. She looked at him. Because I did, he said quietly. Live there. A long time ago. She held the railing of the bridge with both hands. How long, she said. He looked at the river below. I was in Vienna in 1743, he said. I left in 1791. The river moved below them. The city continued its business around them. Cassie held the railing and breathed. Vampire, she said. He looked at her. Yes. She looked at the river. She looked at the city. She looked at his face. The smile, she said. Last month, when I spilled the wine. He nodded. Why, she said. What was it about that specific moment? He was quiet for a long time. Because no one had surprised me, he said finally, in a very long time. And you surprised me completely. He paused. I'd forgotten what that felt like. She let go of the railing. She turned toward him. Tell me everything, she said. They didn't walk back that night. They found a bench on the far side of the bridge and sat on it in the November cold, and he told her, carefully and completely, in the way he did everything, the things he'd been building toward for 5 weeks. He told her what he was, not with dramatic framing, not with the language of confession or apology, but with the plain directness of someone presenting accurate information and trusting the listener to handle it. He had been born in 1701 in a small city in what was now Western Pennsylvania, before it was Pennsylvania, before it was anything with a name that the people living there would have recognized. He had been 26 when he was turned. He did not describe the turning in detail, and she did not ask, understanding from the quality of his silence around it that it was the kind of thing that had been set aside a long time ago. Because it had to be. He had spent the following 3 centuries moving, Europe for much of the 18th and 19th centuries. Back to America after the First World War, which he described not as history, but as something he had watched with the specific exhaustion of a person who had already seen what people were capable of and had not needed to be reminded. Chicago since the 1950s, with periodic absences, with the particular rhythm of someone who had learned that cities changed around you if you stayed too long and started to notice that you didn't. She asked questions. She asked them the way she wrote, reaching for the specific and the concrete rather than the general, wanting the texture of it rather than the outline. She asked what it was like to watch a city become itself. He told her about Chicago in the 60s, the particular quality of a city in the middle of figuring out what it was going to be. She asked what he missed from before. He was quiet for a while, and then said letters. The pace of letters, the way communication had a built-in delay that required you to mean what you wrote, because you were going to have to live with it until the reply arrived. She asked if he was dangerous. He looked at her. Not to you, he said. How do I know that? Because I've had 5 weeks to be dangerous, and I've been careful instead, he said. And because the version of what I am that was dangerous is not a version I've been for a very long time. He paused. I feed. That's a fact. And I won't pretend otherwise. But not from people who don't consent and not in ways that cause harm. There are systems for it now. It took a long time to build them. She looked at his face. She thought about the 5 weeks of Friday nights, the questions he asked, the way he listened, The bench at the service station outside her building 2 Fridays ago, where they'd sat for 20 minutes in the cold because the conversation wasn't finished, and neither of them had wanted to be the one to end it. She thought about the smile, the first real smile in 700 years. She'd asked him about that, earlier on the bridge. An exaggeration, he'd said. But not by much. She looked at the river. "What does your council want you to do?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "They want me to end contact," he said, "to maintain the established distance between what I am and what you are and not create complications." She looked at him. "And what do you want?" He looked at her directly. "I want to stop pretending the walk back to your car is where this ends," he said. She held that. She turned it over in her mind with the same careful attention she brought to the things she wrote, looking for the honest shape of it, for what was true underneath the things that were easier to say. The honest shape of it was that she had been walking to her car for 5 weeks and sitting in it for longer than she needed to before starting the engine. The honest shape of it was that Priya had stopped pretending not to notice and had started making significant eye contact over the textbook every time Cassie came home from a Friday shift. The honest shape of it was that she had not been surprised, sitting on this bridge, hearing what he was. She had been building toward this conclusion for weeks without letting herself complete the thought, because completing the thought required deciding what she was going to do about it. She was deciding now. "It changes things," she said, logistically. "Yes," he said. "I don't know what I'm saying yes to exactly. Neither do I," he said. "Completely. But I know I'd rather figure it out than not." She looked at him on the bench in the November dark. This man who had been alive for 3 centuries and counting, who had watched cities become themselves and lost people in every decade, and still showed up to a restaurant on Friday nights and ate his way methodically through the menu and ordered bread he didn't need to order because he liked it best. She reached over and put her hand over his. His skin was cool, solid, present. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. "Okay," she said. He turned his hand over beneath hers. "Okay," he said. The river moved. The city breathed. 2 people on a bridge in November held the specific and serious quiet of people who had just agreed to something that mattered. She met the council in December. There were 3 of them, which she hadn't expected. She'd imagined council as a larger word, something that implied a full room and formal seating and perhaps a gavel. What she got was 3 people in Elias's penthouse on a Wednesday evening, seated on the furniture she'd come to know as familiar, in a space that now carried the specific quality of somewhere she'd spent real time. Their names were Nadia, Marcus, and a woman named Celeste, who looked 30 and was, Elias had told her, significantly older than that. Nadia had the posture of someone who had decided the outcome of this meeting before it began. Marcus had a quality of measured watchfulness that reminded her of the way Elias watched rooms, though less refined, less practiced. Celeste sat with her hands in her lap and looked at Cassie with an expression that was the most genuinely neutral thing she'd ever seen on a face, which was somehow more alarming than hostility. Cassie sat in the chair across from them. Elias was standing. She'd told him before they came up that she didn't need him to hover, that she was capable of handling a conversation, and he'd looked at her with the slight quality of a person recalibrating, and said, "I know," and positioned himself near the windows where he was present without being in the way. "So," Nadia said, "you know what he is." "Yes," Cassie said, "and you're not leaving." "That seems to be where we've landed." Nadia's eyes were cool and measuring. "What do you want from him?" Cassie looked at her. "What does anyone want from a person they're building something with?" "That's not an answer." "It is, actually. It just requires you to believe that I'm a person with ordinary motivations rather than a strategic actor, and I understand that might be a harder framework for you to apply." Marcus made the sound she'd heard from him in Elias's description, the approximation of a laugh. Celeste said, for the first time, "What are you writing?" Cassie looked at her. "Elias told you about that," she said. "He mentioned it." Celeste said. What is it? A novel, Cassie said, about a woman who discovers the world is larger than she thought and has to decide what to do with that information. The silence in the room shifted. Celeste looked at Elias, then back at Cassie. Is it autobiographical, she asked. It's becoming more so, Cassie said. Nadia stood. She crossed the room to the window and stood with her back to the space for a moment, looking at the city. When she turned back, her expression had changed by a degree. He hasn't smiled, she said, in a very long time. We noticed it first. Before you, I mean. The change in him. He said it was nothing, and then we realized it wasn't nothing. She looked at Cassie with an expression that had shed most of its architecture and was now just a person looking at another person. Whatever you're doing, she said, keep doing it. Then, she picked up her coat and left. Marcus shook Cassie's hand at the door with both of his and said, same as last time, good to meet someone who doesn't flinch. Celeste paused at the threshold and looked back. The novel, she said. When you finish it. I'd like to read it. Then, she was gone. Elias crossed from the window. He looked at her. You told Nadia that her question required her to believe you were a person with ordinary motivations, he said. Yes, she said. She doesn't back down from things, he said. Neither do I, Cassie said. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. She stood up from the chair and closed the distance between them, which wasn't far, which was something she'd noticed about the spaces she occupied with him. They were always smaller than they appeared, always contracted by whatever was moving between them into something intimate and specific. She looked up at his face. 700 years, she said. He looked down at hers. Give or take, he said. She put her hand on his jaw the way she'd been wanting to since the bridge. He went very still, not the careful, composed stillness of his public posture. The other kind, the involuntary kind, the stillness of something that had not been touched with intention in a long time and was not sure, for one held breath, how to receive it. Then, he covered her hand with his. His expression did the thing the smile had done in the restaurant, arrived in increments, each one changing the quality of what came before it. She kissed him. He kissed her back with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything, like she was something worth getting right, like there was no other thing happening anywhere that required any portion of his consideration. The city burned below the windows. The council was gone, and it was just them, in the apartment that had been his for longer than she could conceptually hold, and she felt the specific and serious weight of standing inside something that was going to matter, the kind of mattering that didn't have an obvious end point. She was a writer. She knew about the importance of not looking away from the things that were going to matter. She didn't look away. January arrived, and she moved her writing to his apartment. Not herself. Not yet. Not in the permanent sense, though the question was beginning to develop its own shape in the air between them, the way questions did when they weren't being asked yet but both people were already aware of them. Just the writing, her laptop, her notebooks, the particular configuration of reference materials she needed around her when she was working, the mug she used that Priya had given her with a handle that was slightly too large and that she'd come to depend on for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She wrote at his desk in the mornings. He was elsewhere in the apartment during those hours, giving her the space she needed without being asked for it, which she was coming to understand was one of his fundamental qualities. The ability to read what people needed and provide it without requiring acknowledgement. He read in the evenings. He had a serious relationship with books, the kind of relationship that came from actual decades of having nothing else to do with long, quiet hours, and his shelves were the most real thing about the apartment, worn and uneven, and organized in a way that made sense only to him, chronological in some sections and thematic in others, and in certain corners arranged in a system she'd stopped trying to decode. She started reading the ones he recommended. He recommended carefully, one at a time, chosen with the specificity of someone who had thought about which book went with which person. and she read all of them and told him what she thought, and they talked about them in the way you talked about things when both people had given them real attention. She told him things about the novel. She'd been protective of it before. Protective in the way of someone who didn't want to examine it too closely before it was finished, because close examination might reveal it wasn't there yet, wasn't enough yet, was still just a promising shape without its full substance. But she told him, scene by scene, problem by problem, the structural issues she was circling, and the character she couldn't resolve, and the ending she'd written 4 times in 4 different directions without finding the one that was true. He listened. He asked questions that were better than the questions of anyone she'd ever shown work to, not the reflexive positive questions of someone managing her feelings, but the actual structural questions of someone who wanted to understand what she was trying to do so he could help her figure out if she was doing it. He'd read a lot of books. She told him that. He looked at her with the expression that was becoming familiar, the one where something moved through his eyes that was warmer than his default and more specific. "I've had time," he said. She looked at him across the desk where her laptop was open and his book was closed on his knee. "Does it ever feel like too much time?" she asked. He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. "It used to," he said, "for a long time." He paused. "Less so recently." She looked at him. "Recently as in the last few months," she said. He met her eyes. "Recently as in approximately the night someone spilled wine on me," he said. She turned back to her laptop. But she was smiling. She could feel him register it from across the room, the slight quality of attention that sharpened when she was happy, the way he noticed it, and held it with the same care he held everything about her. She finished the chapter she was working on. She closed the laptop. She went and sat on the arm of his chair, which was something she'd started doing without planning to. The way you started doing things that your body had decided made sense before your mind had formally approved them. He moved to make room without looking up from his book, the automatic accommodation of someone who had registered her approach before she arrived. She leaned against him. He put the book down. They sat like that for a while, in the warm amber of the apartment, with the January city doing its cold work below them, and she thought about what it meant to be comfortable with someone in the specific way that comfort required. Not the absence of anything, but the presence of something. The quiet weight of another person's existence, occupying the same space as yours, without requiring anything from it. She thought about the chair. There had been one chair at his chess table for as long as she'd been coming here. She'd seen it from the first night, registered it without examining it. The solo chair at a game built for 2. He'd added a second one in November. She'd seen it, and said nothing. He'd said nothing. But it was there. She looked at it now from across the room. "What was the last game you played with someone?" she asked. He followed her gaze to the chess table. "A long time ago," he said. "Someone I knew in another city." She looked at the 2 chairs. "Teach me," she said. He looked at her. "Chess." She looked back at him. "You've had 300 years to practice. I have a communication degree and good instincts. Let's see what happens." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to love most, the one that meant she'd surprised him again, the one that looked like a door opening in a wall he'd thought was solid. The corner of his mouth. The full curve. The thing that reached his eyes. The smile. She held it in the way you held things that mattered. Then they played chess, badly on her part and with deliberate restraint on his, and outside the January wind moved through the city they shared, and the board between them had 2 chairs, and the apartment was warm, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came slowly, the way Chicago spring always came, with false starts and reversals, and 1 week in March that was actually winter wearing spring as a disguise. She started staying over. It started practically, the way practical things started. A Friday shift that ran long, and a conversation that ran longer, and a moment at the elevator where it was past 1 in the morning, and the drive back to her apartment on the north side had a specific and obvious pointlessness to it that they both acknowledged without needing to say much about it. She kept a toothbrush there by the end of February, a set of clothes by mid-March. Her books arrived in April, not all of them, not the symbolic everything at once of a move, but the ones she was currently reading and the ones she knew she'd want to reach for, and they went on his shelves in the way things went when they found where they belonged, settling into spaces that had apparently been waiting. Priya threw her a small and ironic going-away party with 2 other friends that involved good wine and the specific warmth of people who were happy for you even though happy for you meant you were leaving. She told them the truth, more or less. She told them he was older than he looked, and that he had a lot of books, and that the apartment was 60 floors above everything, and that she was writing better than she ever had, which was all true. Elias met Priya in March. She'd been to the apartment once, under the guise of returning a jacket, which was transparently not the actual purpose, but which Cassie had appreciated as a delivery mechanism for the real purpose, which was assessment. Priya had spent 45 minutes in the apartment, during which she had examined the bookshelves with the focus of someone gathering data, asked Elias 2 questions that were simultaneously innocuous and revealing, and consumed 1 cup of coffee with the focused attention of someone who was conducting an evaluation and would be providing a verdict later. Later, in Cassie's car, Priya had said he looks at you like you're a solved problem he didn't think he was going to be able to solve. Cassie had thought about that for days. She thought about it now, sitting at the desk with the novel open in front of her, at the point in the 3rd act where the character she'd been circling for months had finally arrived at her own answer. She'd written it that morning, the scene she'd been unable to find for 6 months, and it had come out clean and complete the way things came when you'd finally stopped trying to force them and let them find their own shape. She read it back. It was good. She held that knowledge quietly for a moment, the specific and serious knowledge of having done the thing you were trying to do, which was different from the noise of ambition or the performance of confidence and was just, this is true, this works, this is what I meant to make. She heard Elias in the kitchen, the sound of coffee being made, the particular sequence of his morning routine, which she'd learned the way you learned the sounds of a place you lived in, until they became part of the texture of how mornings felt. She went to the kitchen. He was at the counter, back to her, sleeves of his dark sweater pushed to the forearms. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her, which was unusual. He almost always registered her approach before she announced it, but he was reading something on the counter, and his attention was on that. She watched him. She thought about the wine, 14 months of not spilling a drink, and then the bottle tipped, and the Barolo went left, and the man in the corner chair looked up and smiled for the first time in 700 years, and here she was, in his kitchen in April, watching him make coffee in an apartment that now held her books and her toothbrush and the novel she'd just finished, more or less, in the first real draft of it, which was the most significant thing she'd made. He turned. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted when he saw her face. "What?" he said. "I finished the draft," she said. He set down what he was holding. He crossed to her in the way he crossed distances when it mattered, without ceremony, directly. He held her face in both hands, looked at her. "That's everything," he said. She put her hands over his. "I want to dedicate it to you," she said, "and I want to figure out how to do that without explaining things that aren't mine to explain." She paused. "Help me figure out the wording." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, the layered thing she'd learned to read, the surface composure, and underneath it, the older, warmer, more unguarded thing. "For E," he said, who smiled first. She looked at him. "That works," she said. He kissed her forehead. Then he went back to the coffee, and she went back to the desk, and the morning continued in the warm, specific way that mornings continued when they were part of something larger than a single day. The novel sold in June. She hadn't expected it to be fast. She'd expected the long, grinding patience of the submission process, The months of silence and form rejections, and the particular discipline of continuing to believe in something while the world took its time deciding what it thought. She'd prepared for that. She'd made peace with the waiting as the price of the thing she wanted. It sold in 6 weeks. She was at the desk when her agent called. She heard her name, heard the number, heard the words "we have an offer," and sat very still for approximately 4 seconds before her brain completed the processing. Then she said, "Say that again, please." Her agent said it again. She said, "Okay, yes, please proceed," in the tone of someone who was holding a very large thing very carefully so as not to drop it. She hung up. She sat at the desk for a moment. Then, she went to find Elias. He was in the other room, the one she'd started calling the library room, which was not its official designation, but was accurate, sitting in his chair with a book and the focused stillness of someone genuinely inside something. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He read her face. He set the book down. She crossed the room and sat in his lap, which she'd never done before in quite this way, with quite this specific intention of being held by something that wasn't going anywhere, and he put both arms around her and held her without asking what, because her face had already told him what, and the what was good, and the good required no words yet. She told him anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew." She pulled back to look at him. "You knew it would sell?" "I knew the book was real," he said. The rest was logistics. She looked at him. "You're the most infuriating kind of confident," she said. He looked at her with the expression. The smile arrived. She laughed. He held her, and she laughed, and the city did its June business in the windows, warm now, the lake bright in the distance, and the apartment was full of her books, and his books, and the chest set with 2 chairs, and the novel that was going to be a real thing in the world. And she thought about what it meant to be here, specifically here, in this room, in this life. She thought about the restaurant. She still worked at Aurelius. 4 nights a week, same as before, though the conversation with Derek about the novel had gone in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Derek turning out to have a brother in publishing who had opinions about book deals, and the whole thing had resulted in a warmth between them that made the Friday night shifts feel different, lighter. She liked the work. She'd said this to Elias, and he'd looked at her with the quality of attention he brought to things he found important. "Why?" he'd asked. "Because I'm good at reading people there," she'd said. "And the writing is better when I'm around people. It's not the same thing when I'm only around you." He'd been quiet for a moment. "That's true for anyone," he'd said finally. "You can't only be one version of yourself." She'd looked at him. Most people would be at least slightly put out by that sentence. "I've had time to learn that holding people too tightly is how you lose them," he said. "And I don't intend to lose you." She'd held that for days. She held it now. She looked at his face, at the sharp aristocratic features she'd memorized, and the long brown hair, and the gray eyes that were doing what they always did, settling on her face and staying there. "You never asked me to stop working there," she said. "No. Or to tell anyone about us in any particular way. No. Or to change anything about my life to fit yours." He looked at her steadily. "Why would I?" "Because you could have," she said. "That's the thing. You have a council and a 3-century head start and resources I can't conceptually hold. You could have made this into something that required me to arrange myself around it." His expression was very still. "And instead," she said, "you waited outside a restaurant in November. And you added a chair to a chess table. And you gave me the desk." He was quiet for a moment. The desk had been his. She'd taken it over gradually, and he'd moved his papers to the side table without comment. And at some point the desk had simply become hers, and neither of them had marked the transition. "You didn't need me to give you the desk," he said. "You just sat down at it." She looked at him. "I love you," she said. It was the first time. She'd known it for a while, had been building towards saying it the way she built toward the endings of things, making sure the structure would hold the weight before she put the full weight on it. He looked at her. The expression did what it did. Arrived slowly, the corner of his mouth. The full curve. The thing that reached his eyes and transformed them into something warm and complicated and fully alive. The smile. 300 years, she thought. Give or take. I love you, he said. It was quiet and direct and without performance, and it landed with the specific weight of something that had been true for a while and was now finally being said out loud. She leaned her forehead against his. The city breathed below them in the June warmth. The book came out in February of the following year. The dedication page read, "For E, who smiled first." Her editor had asked about it during one of their calls. The light, curious ask of someone who understood that dedications were private and was asking not to pry, but because she found them touching and wanted to know the story if there was one to tell. Cassie had said it was someone who reminded her that being surprised was still possible. Her editor had said that's beautiful and moved on to the copy edits. The launch was a reading at a bookstore in Wicker Park that held 80 people and sold out in a day and a half. Priya was in the front row. Her parents had driven up from Ohio, her mother in the good coat she saved for significant occasions, her father with a camera he'd owned since Cassie was 12 and had never entirely figured out but used with a loving persistence that resulted in many photographs that were slightly out of focus and completely real. Elias was there. He stood at the back. He'd asked, before she confirmed the date, whether she wanted him to come, in the way he asked things that involved him entering the visible portions of her life, with the understanding that these were her decisions to make and his presence was an offer rather than an assumption. She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. He stood at the back in his dark jacket, and she could see him from the podium, the composed stillness of him, the long brown hair, and she read the opening chapter of her book to a room full of people who were very quiet and attentive in the way of people receiving something that felt real. The opening chapter was about a woman who spilled wine on a stranger, and the stranger smiled. She'd changed some things. She wasn't writing biography or confession, and the novel was its own thing, its own invention, but she'd kept what was true and changed what needed to be changed, and the result was a story about two people finding each other across a significant distance of time and experience, and deciding that the distance was navigable. That's what the reviews called it. A story about navigable distance. She read the opening chapter. Afterward, she signed books for 2 hours, which she had not anticipated being moved by, and which moved her profoundly. The specific intimacy of a stranger handing you a book and asking you to put your name in it. The trust of that. At the end of the night, she found Elias at the back of the emptied store. He was looking at the shelf where her book was displayed, the cover facing out. Her name on it. She came and stood beside him. He looked at the book for a moment, then at her. "You did it," he said. She looked at the cover. At her name. "We did it," she said. He looked at her. She'd told him the story was his too, that whatever he'd given her, the desk and the time and the questions that were better than anyone else's, and the specific quality of being listened to by someone who had genuinely infinite patience, was in the book in the way that everything real was in the writing, invisibly and completely. He'd been quiet for a while after she said that. Then he'd said, "I'm glad the bottle slipped." She'd said, "So am I." Now she looked at the book on the shelf, and then at him, and thought about the wine on the white shirt, and the smile that had arrived like a door opening in a wall she hadn't known was there. She thought about what it meant to be standing on the other side of that door now, in the life that had become real after it opened. She took his hand. He held it. They left the bookstore together and walked out into the February night, Chicago cold and clear and doing its patient work of being a city, and they walked the way they'd walked from the beginning, at the same pace, unhurried, not headed anywhere specific, just moving through the world together in the particular and serious way of two people who had decided that together was the direction. She thought about the first night, the bottle tipping, the wine going left. The moment of held breath, before she looked up to assess the damage. She thought about what she'd been prepared for and what she'd gotten instead. 700 years without smiling. She'd done that. Without knowing, without trying, just by being exactly herself at exactly the wrong moment, she'd done the most important thing. She'd surprised him into being alive again, in the particular way that being alive required, the way that needed another person to make it real, that couldn't be manufactured from stillness and solitude no matter how long you practiced. She was a writer. She understood about the things that couldn't be forced. The February wind came off the lake and she pulled her coat closer, and he was there, steady and cool and completely present, and the city spread around them in every direction, and the book was real and the life was real, and the smile that had arrived on a November night in a restaurant that took itself seriously was still there, less rare now, more practiced, belonging to a face that was remembering what it was for. She looked up at him. He looked down at her, and smiled. She held it the way she'd held it the first time, with both hands, with everything she had. Some things were worth spilling for.